The general organization of this lecture about agile practices is to start with more technically oriented practices like development, release, and quality oriented techniques like testing, and to continue with practices that have more to do with project management. We start, however, with meetings, even though in reality they are more like a management practice, because meetings are so important in agile development. Specific kinds of meetings which define in particular the daily work of a Scrum team or an extreme programming team. These meetings are so important that sometimes they take on almost the aspect of a ritual. The most important of these meetings, although not the first one chronologically, is the daily meeting. We're going to see that there are meetings before, like planning meetings, meetings after, like the review meeting, but what defines the day-to-day working of an agile team, in particular an extreme programming or Scrum team, is in part this daily meeting. So as the name indicates, it's supposed to be held every working day, and specifically it should be held every morning. It should be the first thing that people take part in when they arrive to work in the morning. And the goal is very simple. Since it's a daily meeting, it should define the day's work, but of course in the broader context of the progress of the project. It's supposed to be a short meeting. There is a phobia in the agile world of very long, rambling meetings, technical meetings, which can take far too much time, or organizational meetings, and so the stand-up meeting, as it's sometimes called, is not supposed to be one of these, and there's a strict time limit, usually 15 minutes. Sometimes it's called the stand-up meeting because the idea is that if you attend a meeting standing up, you're not going to have the patience for a very long meeting. In practice, that's not always applied, the standing up idea, but the time limit is usually strictly enforced, so everyone should remain concise, and if someone starts rambling, he or she is soon going to be brought back to order by the others. The meeting should involve all team members, but you remember from the previous lecture the distinction between committed and involved people. So the committed people are those who are supposed all to speak. So every committed member of the team is expected to speak. And what is he or she going to do? Well, we're going to see this on the next slide. It's 3 questions, but before I go to these 3 questions, which are quite important, let's make sure we understand the purpose of this meeting is to define the commitments and to uncover impediments. That is to say, to find out what obstacles may be blocking the ideal progress of the team. It's also important to see what the meeting is not about. Problems are going to come up during the meeting, but usually, unless the solution is simple, it is not the purpose of the meeting to go into deep discussions of how to find the best technical solution. So even for impediments, usually the removal of impediments will take place outside of the meeting, and if an impediment turns out to be a difficult software engineering question, it is not the purpose of the daily meeting to resolve it. The purpose is to identify it so that if necessary some other discussion involving presumably fewer people can be scheduled outside of the daily meeting. So the meeting itself is focused on 3 questions. This is where we have an almost ritual setup, and the 3 questions are codified. What did you do yesterday? What will you do today? Are there any impediments in your way? These are the 3 questions that each committed team member is supposed to answer. I must say it's a quite brilliant idea, and it works well in practice, in particular because the connection between the first 2 questions in a short time frame. Of course, if we were talking about a monthly meeting, it would be much easier to make empty promises as to the second question, what will you do in the next month? But of course, people have memory for one day, and if one day you promise marvels, well, today's what will you do today becomes tomorrow's what did you do yesterday. So the sweet talkers, the ones who promise a lot and don't deliver much, are quickly uncovered, and you cannot do that much hand waving. Also important is the focus on impediment. impediments, and this is of course in Scrum connected with the idea of the Scrum Master, whose task is it in part to whose task it is part of his task is to help remove impediments, and part of the purpose of the daily meeting is to uncover these impediments. So this daily meeting is a very good idea, at least for teams that are physically co-located, and it can be somewhat hard to organize it, of course, in the case of a distributed development team. Also, there are more flexible work arrangements these days. People can partly work from home, so it's not always that easy to work out a daily meeting in practice. So when it's possible, it certainly is a very efficient way to help organize the work of a team. What I have found in my experience is that some adaptations of the daily meeting also work. For example, in our team, we have 2 weekly meetings. It's a distributed team, so it would be unrealistic, if only because of time differences, to have a 15-hour daily meeting. But we've found that 2 weekly 1-hour meetings, one very similar to the Scrum or XP stand-up meeting, and the other more focused on technical discussion and following an agenda, works well. In Scrum, there are a number of other meetings connected with individual iterations, which, as you remember, are called sprints in Scrum. So from now on, when I use the word sprint or the word iteration, it means the same. A planning meeting is held at the beginning of every sprint, and the goal of the meeting is to define the work for that particular iteration. The outcome is a sprint backlog with a time estimate for every task. Now, you remember the distinction of rules in Scrum. So the rule in Scrum is that you have an 8-hour time limit for the planning meeting, divided into 2 parts. So 8 hours is typically a work day, and the first half, say the morning, involves the product owner and the team. Now, we have a product backlog which defines all the functionalities that the entire product eventually is going to provide, although I shouldn't let it sound like it's a requirements document that has been codified at the beginning of the project once and for all. Of course, the product backlog is an evolving document in agile methods and in Scrum in particular, but still at a certain point in time there is a product backlog, and it is under the control, as you remember from the previous lecture, of the product owner. He or she is the one who determines what functionalities are relevant for the customer. So in the first half, the work is devoted to prioritizing the remaining elements in the product backlog. And this, of course, has to involve the product owner. But you also remember from the previous lecture that defining the sprint backlog, the list of tasks for an individual iteration, is not the responsibility of a manager, or in Scrum of a product owner. It's the responsibility of the team. So in strict Scrum, the second half of the meeting is devoted to producing that backlog and is reserved for the team, with no participation of anyone else, including the product owner. That was for the beginning of an iteration. At the end of an iteration, there is a retrospective meeting where all team members reflect on the past sprints, make continuous process improvements, and here the 2 main questions are what went right and what could be improved. The standard here is to have a 3-hour time limit. This is an internal meeting for the team. It does not normally involve outsiders like customers, for example. There's also another meeting which is destined for the other stakeholders as well, and of course for the team as well. So this is where the team meets the customers. And by the way, I'm not implying that the review meeting occurs after or before the retrospective. It could be either way, but it might be that it's better to have the review meeting with the customers first and then the retrospective. So the review meeting is devoted to analyzing what has been done, and the question is what has been completed, what has not been completed. Of course, it should present the completed work to the stakeholders, and what better way is there to present completed work than to demo it. Remember the agile emphasis on producing a working system at every iteration. Well, this is the opportunity to show to the customers what has been done. And of course, remember the whole discussion of waste. Anything that is incomplete will not be demonstrated, and the emphasis is on what has been done and can be demoed, and there is, as a standard, a 4-hour time limit. Let me use this opportunity to mention a somewhat related idea emphasized in the Crystal method, the notion of reflective improvement. We are getting very close here to ideas emphasized in a completely different part of the software engineering world, something which is often considered at the other extreme on the spectrum as compared to agile methods, CMMI, the capability maturity model integration. This is the more process-oriented approach, much more process-oriented, and there is at level 5, the top level of the CMMI, a notion of self-improvement, where the process is organized so that it includes mechanisms to include itself, to include the process itself. And here, this is an area where some very different software engineering techniques, such as Agile on one hand and CMMI on the other hand, really meet. And in fact, a number of people have attempted to combine CMMI and Scrum or other Agile methods. So here, it's kind of the same idea. Developers, according to the Crystal rules, should take breaks from regular development to look for ways to improve the process. So it's not necessarily a specific meeting at a specific time, it's regular meetings to improve the process, and iterations help with this in the Crystal view by providing feedback on whether or not the current process is working, so we get an idea that is very similar to the Scrum review meeting. What we've seen in this first segment is that a major part of Agile development is the set of well-defined meetings taking a kind of ritual role that define the day-to-day life and the iteration to iteration progress of an Agile project with well-defined goals, outcomes, and participants. The most important is the daily meeting. In Scrum, we also have planning, review, and retrospective meetings. And we have also hinted at the fact that these meetings were really designed for the ideal case of a team, a classical team that is all together under one roof. And for distributed teams and modern forms of work, these ideas may require adaptations, but they're still based on very sound ideas.